Well, hi everybody. Father Alex here, host of the Godcast, also the vicar of St Matthew's Church in Burnley, and also the author of Our Daily Bread from Argos to the Altar, a priest story, which is available in all good bookshops and online. So do check that out. My guest today on the Godcast is Rob Wickham. Now, Rob is a Church of England bishop. He is the chief executive of the Church Urban Fund. He's the former Bishop of Edmonton and acting Bishop of Portsmouth. So we're going to be talking about urban matters on this episode of the Godcast. So do enjoy it. And if you do enjoy it, then do check out my other interviews. Lots of people of faith on there and celebrities, musicians, writers, and politicians, something for everybody. So thanks for watching and enjoy this interview now with Bishop Rob Wickham.
Okay.
Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is Bishop Rob Wickham. Bishop Rob, it's fabulous to get you on the Godcast. How are you?
I'm very well, Father Alex. Yeah, no, very much looking forward to these precious moments together.
Yes, me too. Now, you are almost coming up to celebrating your first anniversary as the chief exec of the Church Urban Fund. Rob, just for people who aren't familiar with that, just tell us a little bit about the roles and the responsibilities that you have, but also perhaps a little bit about Church Urban Fund, if you would.
Yeah, brilliant. So Church Urban Fund has been around since 1987, and it was one of the products, really. It was one of the Faith in the City report, which was that sort of marvelous, extraordinarily hard-hitting report from the mid-1980s, where the Church of England decided to do a commission in terms of kind of areas of poverty, areas of deprivation, and what the church should do about poverty, right? Significant rising levels of poverty. And in the end, they decided that it was time for everyone to club together to help our poorer brothers and sisters effectively in those days. And so the fund was set up in a matter of a few years. About £20 million was raised right across the country of churches hearing the stories of the inner city and deciding that it was right they made a difference about it. So every diocese pledged a particular amount of money that they would raise. The majority of dioceses went far over the levels which were being asked of them, because it really captured something of the imagination and the public mood about wanting to just help out in terms of these levels of poverty which hadn't been revealed beforehand. And so the Church Urban Fund came from that. It then took us a number of years to spend all that money that was raised in projects that were working on the ground level. And since then, the Church Urban Fund has been seeking to support ways to encourage and support and mobilize Christians and the Christian community to be able to tackle poverty at source in their local communities, to understand their local communities perhaps a little bit better, and to really grapple with the stuff of what it's like to live in that particular part of wherever they may be. And so that's been at the heart of what we've been aiming to do really for the last sort of 30 years or so.
And your historical context is very much in this area, isn't it, Rob? You are somebody who's driven by this. Just tell us about those early days of your own calling and what you felt was leading you to work in this, in these areas of deprivation and how that reflected in your own ministry as a younger priest.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it comes before ordination, really, this sort of sense of calling to such work. I mean, I grew up in Surrey, in the gin and jag belt of Surrey, which is a tremendous privilege. I'm aware. And then I spent a year work. Oh, sorry, I spent 3 years studying geography in Durham University. And a big part of that was looking at urban regeneration and what makes different places feel the way they feel. So a bit of regeneration, a bit of perception, humanistic work, and really tried to get to grips with that sort of sense of, life feels pretty different depending on where you were brought up, depending on what sort of community you're part of, and what makes different places tick the way that they do. And so that was, and a big part of my dissertation work then was looking at housing stock and looking at, the kind of housing which you're in, the effect that that has upon the way in which you live and your experiences. So housing has been a particular sort of a part of my brief as well. And then I had a year working for a church on Wallsend in Tyneside, which is one of those really kind of really formational years, where half my time was spent working for the church, working at St Luke's Wallsend, just up the road from the Swan Hunter shipyard. My granddad once upon a time worked at that shipyard, so it felt as if there was a bit of an affinity. And this was in the early 1990s. And at the time, Swan Hunter Shipyard was threatened with closure. In fact, it did close down. And so that whole sort of sense of what it means to be in a part of the world where deep history of manufacturing industry, what happens when that comes to an end. So it's living with those sorts of issues within the local community. Then also half my time was spent in a church-based drop-in centre on the Meadowell estate, or the Ridges estate as it was locally known. Which the year beforehand had been through some pretty awful unrest, really, of rioting and so on and so forth. And so it's a place of huge regeneration by the North Tyneside Council and by government and by others. And this was a year really which made me think, Rob, this is part and parcel of who you need to be. I remember Maundy Thursday night through to Good Friday morning, being part of the watch in church, the Maundy Thursday watch. And at about 5 in the morning, I did the 3 till 5 slot through the night. And at 5 o'clock in the morning, just as the sun was rising, I went outside for a bit of a walk, and I ended up walking down by the shipyard Good Friday morning to these now motionless cranes. And a deep, deep sort of sense of God saying, Rob, you need to be working in communities which are, some of the most marginalized and some of the most vulnerable communities, particularly economically. Real sort of sense of God's call upon my life. And that has shaped each of the places where I've ministered, certainly since ordination, and has shaped certainly the ministry which I'm doing now.
And how has poverty changed over those years, Rob? I mean, when I was growing up in the 80s, and I've lived in Burnley most of my life, and I've never really, I've written about this. I've never really known a time where poverty didn't exist. But in the 80s and perhaps maybe the early 90s, it wasn't so much about the impact of addiction, or if it was probably alcohol related rather than drug related. What would you say? Have you noticed a shift, and how seismic has it been over the years?
I mean, the statistics I think really bear this out, Alex, in that, at one level, the really shocking thing about poverty levels is that as a general kind of holistic measure, they've not gone down in 30, 35 years. If anything, at the moment, they're going up, as we've seen in recent, in recent research that's been released. So at one level, at the levels of absolute poverty that people experience, have remained at somewhere between 23 to 26% of the population, which rose in the time of the 1980s. It rose up from 12, 13%. So it practically doubled in the 1980s. And I think the difference now is that, number one, we've got used to it. And I don't sort of sense there is much a kind of righteous anger. I mean, Faith in the City report was great at one level because it really harnessed that sort of sense of people's anger as to why levels of poverty were increasing the way in which they were. We've now just got used to it. So I think there is something about the fact that we've got used to these sorts of numbers in one of the richest economies in the world, these sorts of numbers of people living in poverty. The big difference, it seems to me, is there's something about digital poverty, which is obviously a relatively new thing, which does drive a big wedge between the haves and the have-nots, and we saw that hugely during COVID. When the church went online, what I was picking up in the areas where I was a bishop in North London was that those areas which were desperately poor in North London, families who were using mobile data needed to decide as to whether they were going to go to church or go to school. That was the choice. In many different ways, whereas most of us who've got access to Wi-Fi just take it for granted. You can do all this kind of stuff all in one go. So I think that the digital poverty, particularly over COVID, became very, very clear in terms of where the fault lines were. But I think on top of that, the kind of big difference is that poverty, the depths of poverty are more acute now in terms of cost of living crisis. And the fact that we've got people who are in full-time employment are going to food poverty projects, should be making us all feel very wound up and very angry, actually. But at the same time, the levels of wealth that there's a smaller number of people who are extraordinarily wealthy. So I think the disconnect between the wealthiest and the poorest, and I found this really kind of kind of knocked home to me, is that as a vicar, I spent 6 years as being the vicar of a place called Somerstown in London, which is between King's Cross Station and or St Pancras Station and Euston Station. It's an estate church which was based in that part of town. And then when I was the bishop some years later, I lived in Hampstead in the same borough, in the borough of Camden. And Hampstead kind of well known for its wealth and so on and so forth. That's where the bishop's house was. It was a former vicarage in that part of town. And it was the realization that that life expectancy levels between Somerstown and Hampstead was 18 years difference. I mean, these are shocking figures which talk about kind of deep levels of kind of disconnect within our society, but just knocks home to me in terms of the differences in terms of what poverty now looks like, I think, which was different before.
I think some really interesting stuff in there. I mean, the point about the phones. I mean, people in our context here in Burnley, if they had mobile phones, quite often they were burner phones and had no access to, they weren't smartphones, so they couldn't access a church service anyway. And then when you refer to those depths of poverty that we see now, I recently interviewed Tom Sander, who is the vicar of St Giles in the Field, who described that people who are working and were living in tents in central London are being evicted from tents, but they were holding down jobs. It almost sounds ridiculous, doesn't it?
And certainly from, I mean, from looking at the night shelter projects and things like that, I mean, it looks again slightly different as a result of COVID, but the church and community-based night shelters, I've run them for years, and I've always been really struck as to how increasing numbers of people who are part of those church-based night shelters would leave in the morning with their suits on and go to work.
Yeah.
I mean, it is extra. I think, I just think, when you hear of the latest figures in terms of how much money out of kind of salaries and things people are spending on accommodation, and particularly in the rental markets, I think it's absolutely shocking.
And as you progress through God's calling upon your life, Rob, you become acting bishop of Portsmouth and then bishop of Edmonton. Was that I speak to some bishops, and one of the things they miss about becoming a bishop is it then removes them from that cutting edge on the ground kind of ministry. Was that a difficult transition for you? But also, was it what benefits did it afford you in your role, or what shackles did it place around your ankles as well?
So I mean, being a bishop is a wonderful and extraordinary privilege, and to have served for, I mean, it was 8 years in Edmonton, and to serve for a year in Portsmouth was an extraordinary privilege for me, actually. And one of the things I kind of love about, I mean, one of the things I reflected on in terms of being a bishop in the Church of England, particularly being an area bishop. So in London, Edmonton, it was 4 London boroughs, and it was serving 1.2 million people. It was about 120 churches, 60 odd schools that we were part of. And it just gives you extraordinary access into people's lives, lots and lots of people's lives. So, every Sunday I was doing 2 or 3, or kind of, sometimes 2 confirmations. And in those occasions, you get wheeled into these wonderful big celebrations where everyone's happy and they pulled out all the kind of red carpet and all that sort of stuff. But the glorious thing is that you're meeting with people who have made decisions about their walk with Jesus Christ, and they share that with you. In a moment. So one level, the stranger bishop turns up, and people are just suddenly being really honest about where they're coming from, and really honest about their walk with Jesus, and those sort of sense of decision moments that people have had. And quite often those decision moments come out of crisis moments. So to hear something of the grace of God at work in people's lives was an enormous privilege. Likewise, the doors that it opens politically, and be it with members of parliament, or be it with council, or be it with the NHS, all sorts of doors open for people who wear purple shirts, and that's a real privilege. In terms of the shackles, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the times of year where I found it kind of hardest was actually Christmas and Easter, because again, as an area bishop, we didn't have cathedrals or anything like that in terms of area bishops. We had patches that we were making appointments for, and all that sort of stuff. But it was the lack of community around you. So particularly Christmas and Easter, the journeys of Advent, the journeys of Lent, which were at times where I took really seriously as a parish priest, in terms of taking a whole community on this journey that takes us towards the crib, or takes us towards the cross. are enormous privileges in terms of journeying with people, because so much comes out the woodwork when you are having those sort of home groups, or groups in church, or sermon series, whatever it might be, in those moments of privilege.
Yeah.
I mean, the other shackle is of course, the roles themselves are pretty, there aren't, I mean, none of us have got sort of vast numbers of resources, but I was conscious, particularly with COVID and beyond, quite a lot of my time is being spent in terms of people quite rightly making complaints when people have got complaints to make. And I think one of the reflections over that time was particularly when you've got things like ICSA looking at our conduct. And quite rightly, again, challenges to the place of deference and increasing levels of accountability. It meant that the role itself actually changed quite considerably over the 8 years that I was doing it. And I kind of certainly rejoice in increasing levels of accountability. I think that's good for everyone. So lots of stuff there.
Yeah, very, very interesting to hear the pros and cons of being in the role as of bishop, and a little bit around poverty now, Rob. When we, I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet around food banks, Rob, at the moment. I think they are rightfully lauded and applauded for the work they do, but they've almost become kind of part of, like you said, you alluded to it a few moments ago. It's almost normal, isn't it, that a town will have at least 4 or 5 food banks in them, and that's certainly the case in Burnley, and I know it's the case across Lancashire, and I'm sure it is in your context as well. But we're actually now in a place where even our food banks are struggling, aren't they, Rob? We've got food banks that are actually struggling to keep going because people can't sustain the amount of giving that we're doing. And I know of food banks that are actually running a loss. What do you think that says about society, Rob, that we've normalized food banks and this is where we are today?
So I mean, I think with the food poverty that you're describing, I mean, there's all sorts of things there that we could sort of tease out. I think one of the things that concerns me the most in terms of the use of the increasing levels of food banks are the stories of as need increases, and as the kind of the need for volunteers is a big issue, I'm aware, in all sorts of our communities. I mean, what I hear from the Trestle Trust and from others is that as need increases, effectively become much more transactional, which I think has the danger of kind of exacerbating people's experience of what it means to have the need to go to food banks. There's the you know the, the complexity of poverty is that it's not just about material poverty. It is about relational poverty. It's about poverty of identity and all sorts of other things as well. And so my deep concern about the way in which quite a lot of the way in which we deal with food poverty is it's just on a transactional basis. And I think human beings need more than that. It's not we don't just survive, do we? In terms of what we eat and what we drink. There's the thriving element which comes from our relationships and how we relate to one another. And I think for me that's one of the kind of critical elements here. We see it in our immigration policies. We see it in all sorts of kind of political stances, really. Which takes us right back to the story of Adam and Eve, and so from the scriptures, it takes us right to the story of Cain and Abel, with that sort of deep question when God asks, when the brother has been killed, the deep question of that God asks, well, the response rather is given, am I my brother's keeper? And I think this is a fundamental question that each generation needs to be asking in terms of the posture of, am I my brother's keeper? If the answer to that is no, then that leads to destruction. That leads to the widening sense of poverty. It leads to a much more fragmented, humanity, where there is less care around and there is less kindness around, and these sorts of fundamental kind of Christian behaviors, these fundamental kind of Christian marks of what makes a society an excellent society, But if the answer is yes, that I am my brother or my sister or my sibling's keeper, then actually it requires a different kind of posture of the decisions that we make have a knock on in terms of other people. Who we vote for will have a knock on in terms of other people. How we relate to food banks, food poverty, and so on has a knock on. And that whole sort of sense of recognizing that to get the best kind of society in which we're in, which is kind of breaking in all sorts of different ways. It comes from that fundamental question of asking ourselves, am I responsible for that which is beyond me? And certainly for me as a Christian, the answer is yes.
Yeah, I think it is for a lot of us, but I think there is you may or may not agree, but there's a lot of hypocrisy that we can be charged with, isn't there, within the church? In our own kind of, I don't really want to get into the LLF stuff too much in this interview, but we are not examples of that, are we? I mean, I'm on General Synod, and I'm pleased to say at the last synod it seemed to soften a little bit, but prior to that it was a really volatile and unpleasant place to be, Rob.
Yeah.
And the other context of that is that through my own writing and my own media presence, I've called for a more compassionate and caring society, but when I released my book, I have emails, particularly from Middle England, from provincial places around the south, challenging me whether poverty is real, whether it is really like that, and I say yes, it is, but it's not just about food poverty, is it? I was going to come on to perhaps my next question is when we look at poverty beyond food, we can look at aspirational poverty, we can look at spiritual poverty, we can look at mental health, physical poverty. Those all those things go into the pot, and when you put them into a pot, it can create some very difficult circumstances for people living in urban settings, in working class towns and cities. What would yours and maybe the Church Urban Fund's response to that is how do we go about righting these wrongs or narrowing the gap between care and uncare?
I mean that's the mega question of our time, isn't it, Alex? And I think it's a helpful question. I mean, I think for me, there's something about partnerships here, about how do Christians and others respond in partnerships. The danger from as you're describing it, in terms of some of my reflections in terms of the church, there's always the danger in terms of churches being seen as homogenous organizations at one level. And yes, they're separate charities, but there's something about the calling to realize the kingdom of God. There's something about recognizing that if there is a gospel priority for the poorest and the most marginalized in our society, these are the places where we find God already at work and God dancing and so on and so forth. And these are the places of riches learning. So for me, there's something about how, to whom are we learning? To whom do we turn to be our teachers? And there's something about creating space for those who are at the brunt of poverty, to be given a voice, to be able to share, because and that does need to kind of influence the way in which people respond in terms of as you say, acts of kindness and so on and so forth. And I'm conscious that, in the 1980s with the Faith and City report, that it was that was captured. It was actually Middle England responding to the stories of the plight of the poorest. And I think, in our churches particularly, we have an obligation to be able to enhance and really tell those stories, to platform and really tell those stories about what reality is like. And having something different other than yourself to focus on, because part of my reflections in a lot of churches is that gathered congregations, kind of looking after each other is one thing. Something about what does it mean to be parochial? What does it mean to be parish churches? And as you'll be aware, the definition of parochial means outside the house, not inside the house. And so there's a sort of sense in terms of how do we develop and really be able to be confident in our places of being there for everyone within our society and in our communities. And so it sort of strikes me that there's something again about posture of the way in which we're able to reach out into the kind of different corners. It comes back from that wonderful sort of stuff that's in the in the ordinal for particularly for deacons about, part of our responsibility is to go outside the house, to go and search out the lost, to go and listen to the most marginalized, and to bring those stories to the center of church life is the diaconal calling that's in the ordinal. And so there's something for me just in relation to kind of, reawakening some of that, particularly with the gospel bias, which is so clear in the scriptures, to be able to serve alongside the most marginalized and most vulnerable in our society.
And just within that, Rob, you talked about caring for others. There is also care of self, isn't there? And this is just, I suppose, maybe a supportive word for clergy and people who are working in that context. I had to take January off, but and so did my colleague. It just the walls were coming in on us, and the weight load was extraordinary, and the bad news was extraordinary. And I'm pleased to say that I have a very supportive bishop in Bishop Philip North, and we both come through the other side of that. But it does pose a question for the church, doesn't it, about do they support churches enough? I'm sure will know Father Luke Lorne, who is a friend of mine who's also been on the Godcast. He uses very strong languages when he describes the gap between what we're given and what we should have. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that, Rob. The church again could be charged with hypocrisy because we are a very extraordinarily wealthy institution, and is there enough money coming into the right places? And if not, how can you help with your work with the Church Urban Fund support that?
So there's two or three things here, Alex. I mean, it's a really, really helpful question. And as we continue to reflect on what it, from our experience of COVID and so on and so forth, my knowledge, I listen to clergy, I meet with clergy, I meet with church leadership on a regular basis. And people are tired, you know, and therefore, there is that sort of sense of a need to really pray in and prioritize again that sort of sense of kindness and pastoral care and pastoral support. I mean, I'm not going to go down the line of kind of saying what does good Episcopal ministry and that sort of thing kind of look like and so on. Although I do think creating the right kind of environment for clergy to thrive is an absolute Episcopal must, and hopefully over the 8 years something which I put into practice in terms of the patch where I was the bishop for. But that whole sort of sense, I think, of being able to recognise, I think particularly in areas of greatest deprivation, the stresses and the strains which clergy are under. And I remember myself when I was the vicar of Somerstown. I was getting 25 people a week banging on my door asking for whatever it is they're asking for. Likewise, in Hackney, there was a kind of constant demand which you don't feel in other places, in other parishes. And so, when you're surrounded by, such extreme levels of need all the time, there is a sort of sense about what are the best ways in which we can support, encourage, what are the best ways in which we can financially support and encourage? Because it's clear, isn't it, from a financial perspective across the church that money is not spread evenly in terms of what resources aren't spread evenly. Certainly in my patch in North London, as the bishop, there was a gospel priority in terms of resources to the wealthiest. In terms of the numbers of the size of parishes. And when you go down the line of pastoral organisation, who misses out? Well, actually, the parishes in areas of greatest deprivation tend to get bigger, is what I see. And so there is a sort of sense in terms of needing to ask the bigger questions in terms of whether the monies are placed in the right way. I mean, what I am heartened in terms of some of the more recent developments across how we use resources across the church. When I look at some dioceses around, the priority parishes in Bristol, or the Magnificat parishes in Bath and Wells, or some of the work that's now in Portsmouth diocese, in your own diocese. I've seen Bishop Philip North and others do a real push for how do we get more resources for areas of greatest deprivation, the estates ministry task group. I do think across the church there is a rising level of recognition that we have turned our back on areas of greatest deprivation, and at least the beginnings of a desire to do something about it, because the haves and the have-nots, as we were saying earlier on, has been so exacerbated through COVID. I'm not surprised that from COVID, we're now speaking much more prophetically and openly about racial justice. The area that we really do need to get our hands on and sort of grapple with are issues to do with justice around class and some of that stuff, which does sort of squash the church in all sorts of different ways. And it goes back to my kind of point at the earlier point about how do we ensure that there are spaces for those who are struggling and those who are hurting to be able to share something of those experiences, because it strikes me it's not programs which will change people's experience, it's creating space for people to be able to talk. It's about people, it's about people flourishing. That's right at the heart of all this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I get a bit irritated with all the hot air and bluster about church renewal, Rob, where we, engaging young people, and I found the position of the role of deconstructing whiteness not very helpful at all. When I think about renewal of the church, and I'd be interested to know if you agree with me, but I absolutely think the renewal of the church will come in the margins. It will come in the places, the urban places of deprivation, because I feel these people have lost trust in many other things in their lives, whether it's relationships, careers, social security, social workers, governments, local government. But actually, when churches reach out to these places, and through this is coming from a place of experience where we weren't always in this place, that we become a place of sanctuary, a place of trust where people reach out to us for help, and it can be exhausting, but we always do our best to help them. Do you agree with me, Rob, that the renewal of the church will come in the margins? And it's very gospel for me. It's very gospel led. I'm just interested to know what you think.
I'm completely with you. I mean, that's been my experience in parish ministry as well. The ways in which I mean, people like your good self, Alex, and thank you for the work that you do. I'm so grateful to you for the work that you're doing in your parish, and the faithfulness of the way in which you are able to bring the issues that you're bringing to in terms of a wider audience. I think that's an important prophetic ministry, which is part and parcel of what we're describing. Any kind of renewal comes from the margins. It doesn't come from the centre. The renewal of the Church of England won't come from bishops. We're always, bishops are the ones who are going to be, wonderful playing catch up in terms of what the Spirit is doing. My sort of sense, I say, from what I see, the ministry of the Spirit at work at the moment, is a reawakening of a sense of gospel priority for this work. And I mean, there's something, isn't there, about the data which people collect. This is one of my bugbears at the moment, if I may. I'm conscious for the endless numbers of data things that I've had to fill in as a parish priest in my time. There's always that sort of sense of, are the right questions being asked? It's a bit like if we're thinking about mission action planning for our churches, is how are we going to grow this church the right question to ask? I'm not quite sure if it is actually. For me, there's something about faithfulness to Jesus Christ, which is right at the heart of what we're about. But also there's something of, in this context, in this community, what kind of church do we need to be? And that's a very different question to the one of how we're going to grow the church in this place. And it really roots it in what the needs are, the contextual needs of that particular place, and the way in which God's love affair, God's interaction with his people. And I think, areas which are serving the communities of greatest deprivation know this much more than a more middle class sort of inward looking type community. And so for me, there's something about the ability to be able to look outwards, because you've got to look outwards in terms of being able to respond to the needs of the very local, particularly if there's lower social mobility. It's very obvious as to where the needs of the church are. The one thing that does have to change, as far as I can see, or certainly needs a lot of work on, is that sort of sense of the data that we collect largely revolves around how many people come in and say their prayers on a Sunday. And I'm conscious from the work that you do and so many others across the country, most of the work that takes place from churches is excluded from the data that is collected centrally. So it means it doesn't even enter into it. And I do think, the more I reflect, certainly in my role at CUF, is that, you value, the stuff that you value is the stuff that you collect data on. And that tells me there's a big piece of structural work that we need to do, which is a recognition of the value of the work which so many churches are doing in food banks, in terms of, kind of parent groups, or outreach to those who are, in terms of poverty, or kind of elderly, or whatever it might be. This is the bread and butter, it seems to me, of a church in an area of greater deprivation, the way in which it serves the local, and none of that is captured in terms of our data collection. And so I think there's a really big piece of work which really encapsulates the value of what churches are and what they bring to the local community, in a way which actually those who are decision makers, may not properly grasp. And I say that as someone, I went to a place of welcome a few months ago, which is one of the kind of programs that CUF oversees. And, 20 people in this place of welcome is up in Walsall, up in the Midlands. And 20 people were there. And when I went round all of them and sort of said, why are you here? What brings you here? And 6 of them told me that was the only time that week that they were going to meet another human being. Now, of course, I'm there as the new CEO of CUF, and to cheer everyone on and all that kind of stuff. But I had to move from the posture of being the CEO to the posture of being a learner, of being a disciple. Because when you hear the sorts of things like, this is the only time this week I'm going to meet with another human being, you see the value much more in terms of that interaction. Wasn't a Sunday morning, wasn't in church. It was over a cup of tea. It was in a room, and it was over a bit of cake. But the value for that one or those 6 individuals, and the knock on in terms of probably meaning that those 6 individuals, aren't going to their GPs. They're not going to the local hospital or whatever it might be. And we don't capture any of that stuff.
No.
And yet the renewal, those sorts of examples. And I think there is something about, again, the importance of listening, because that is way beyond my experience. My diary is just so full that actually, finding a meeting for someone, sometimes it might be 2 or 3 weeks before I can meet with someone. So I can't make the decisions about where you put resources and things in those sort of situations, unless I've been fully informed by the people, the lived experience stuff that thankfully is becoming more and more common.
Yeah, again, I think it's so important to what you've said, and I think the context is so important. We're meeting my colleague, my colleague Reverend Cat, are meeting with the National Safeguarding Advisor to talk about the context of safeguarding in urban and deprived places. I mean, goodness me, Rob, if we went to safeguarding on some of the conversations we had immediately, we would never be away from safeguarding. The context of the ministry is such that people speak in a certain way. They speak with a certain industrial language. They tell you as it is, but we know the context of it, and I think it's really important. Rob, we've been talking. We've gone over time. It's been so fascinating talking to you. But as we record this, Rob, we are on the cusp of Holy Week, and I was just wondering if you could just offer maybe a thought or a prayer, particularly for people who'll watch this. Many of them, most of the people who follow me are working in an urban context and on the fringes of society, and I've got so much admiration and respect for my brothers and sisters who are doing the same work that we are in Burnley. So, but you're the big guy. You're the guy with the mitre. So, give us a few words of encouragement, would you please, as we approach Holy Week?
It's Holy Week for me, and particularly areas of greatest deprivation. This is our bread and butter. Gosh, the place of hope that we can get in Holy Week, and the fact that our story is so intimately entwined with Holy Week. The fact that day in, day out, we're dealing with issues to do with, and people have been let down, the fact that people have been betrayed, the fact that promises have been broken, all that kind of stuff. The experience of the disciples, what have you, in the upper room with Jesus, the despair of Jesus, that he prays so fervently in terms of the following day, and so on in the garden, the levels of anxiety and absolute kind of pain which is there in all the midst of it, coupled with the fact that people get angry. And I'm conscious that Peter, as Jesus being arrested, takes out a knife and stabs someone. This is Peter who does that. And that sort of sense of abandonment that Jesus sort of cries out from the cross. And yet the following, in the following days, Jesus meets with Mary when she's there, and she is frozen in a graveyard and just utters her name, meeting her in a place of absolute desperation, thinking that the body of Jesus had been taken away. The fact that Jesus then takes Simon Peter again off for a little walk, and says, "Feed my lambs," the lambs being the most vulnerable, the most marginalized. And I just think, time and time again in the Holy Week story, we are seeing glimpses of everyday humanity that colleagues, that friends, those particularly in areas of greatest deprivation, will be experiencing time in and time out. And this is not an alien, an alien thing. You can see glimpses of crucifixion all around you. In terms of the areas where you're working, but also it tells me that wherever you find glimpses of crucifixion, you will find glimpses of the resurrection. And so for me, there's something about the value and the importance of the work that you're doing, because it gives me and Cuff, and no doubt so many others, a real sense of hope as to why we do the work that we do, making, enabling, the dancing that Jesus does in terms of the reality of life. That we're sharing today, and all rooted in that sort of sense of, for God so loved the world, so undergirded with that sort of deep sense of love. So I am really grateful to all the colleagues who are working in areas of greatest deprivation. You hold the stuff of life in your hands, both crucifixion and resurrection, and the story of Holy Week will come alive throughout the year, I'm aware, time and time again. And God bless you for your presence, for your perseverance. God bless you for your prayerfulness, being rooted in the communities where you are. I pray that you are blessed in abundance this Holy Week and Easter.
That's a lovely place to end it, Rob. Thanks so much for coming on the Godcast. Thank you very much. Thank you.